Stefan Wolff, it's June 6, 2023. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
Well, listen, the northern corridor seems to be blocked because of Belarus and Russia. The middle corridor has its own risks and anything can happen. Does that make Iran the main corridor for Belt Road Initiative in ambitions of China, or in its integral piece on that map and trajectory?
Well, it probably could, but as you know, I mean, the route through Iran is not without its own risks and dangers either. I mean, Iran, on the one hand, is maybe not quite as heavily sanctioned as Russia and Belarus, but it is still a country that is under a certain degree of sanctions. We have just seen violence breaking out on the Iranian-Afghan border, which obviously does not bode well for sort of the general stability along those lines. And on top of that, I think there's also a potential here of rival exit routes or transit routes that would actually not go east-west, but rather north-south. Now that Russia and Iran seem to have finally come to an agreement on sort of closing the last gap that they had in their own connection north-south from Russia through Azerbaijan and then Iran and to the Arabian Sea. So I think Iran is potentially going to be pivotal in sort of these kinds of connections that we are talking about. But my own hunch at the moment would be that there will certainly be another push and potentially more investment going into making the middle corridor more viable, certainly in the long term.
Stefan, it's great to have you with us, given your knowledge of, you know, the Balkans westwards and Balkans eastwards. On that middle corridor, you have researched on this, so it'd be wonderful to get your insights on how important is China as an actor for the Balkans, one, and secondly, why is the BRI so significant when the EU is the master planner in that part of Europe?
Right. Okay. Two questions one could easily write a couple of books about. So let's
if I may say so, you've made a good start in your own writings.
Well, yes, a little bit. I think to begin with the first question, why is China so important in the Western Balkans? I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, China really has viewed the Balkans route as quite important in its general connections to the European markets for some time. It isn't, however, necessarily only dependent on the middle corridor. I mean, there's a long-established connection that goes through the port of Piraeus in Greece that uses the maritime part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But a lot of those projects, I mean, Piraeus is a fairly secure outpost for China, but connections from there, they are not as straightforward as maybe had been the plan 5 or 10 years ago. So the railway connection up towards Serbia and then Hungary into the EU, that is still not entirely complete, and obviously has its own problems and challenges. China has also had some setbacks with quite a number of its investments in the Western Balkans. So the road to nowhere in Montenegro is one example, which has plunged that particular country into a really severe external debt crisis for no particular certainly no particularly obvious benefit. China has also invested into various coal-fired plants in the Western Balkans that have been received quite badly, both in Brussels from the perspective of environmental standards, but also in the sense that there has been quite a bit of pushback from the local population that is obviously affected by the detrimental environmental efforts of that. So I think in that sense, China still is an important investor in the region. It obviously also has a foothold there in various media businesses that push, let's say, more China optimistic messages than what you would normally get. But very clearly, I think if we compare it, for example, to the region of Central Asia, China is only a secondary player in the Western Balkans. And geography very obviously makes this really where the EU is the dominant actor. And even though EU accession is difficult and prolonged and protracted and has huge complications, it's still more likely to happen. And so I think the long-term trajectory of the Western Balkans clearly is towards the EU, which doesn't mean there can't be Chinese investment, that there can't be a Chinese presence, but I think that will be much more limited. And as we have seen in the past, China is not necessarily unwilling to play by EU rules. So a couple of years ago, there was a big investment that China made in Croatia. And that then actually also applied for EU funding, got this EU funding. So China, in that sense, was quite willing also to accommodate to European standards, procurement rules, and so on and so forth. So I think from that perspective, I think there will be a Chinese presence for sure in the Western Balkans, but it will not be comparable to the weight that China has the further east we are going, especially when we end up all the way in Central Asia. So that was the first question. Now, the second question, if I recall correctly, was about why the middle corridor is important for China.
Yes.
Right. Okay, good. So, memory still working?
No, it's working very well.
So I think the middle corridor for China is, the way I see it right now is China is hedging here, because clearly, the middle corridor has loads and loads of problems. The one problem that it doesn't have at the moment is it doesn't go through Russia and Belarus, and therefore would not be affected by sanctions. But the capacity that it has at the moment is very limited. What I've seen and sort of what my own estimation is that this is well below 10% of what could potentially be shipped through the much more developed infrastructure of the northern corridor. Now that has a lot of different factors. There are a lot of different factors that would explain that. First of all, it's multimodal. So you have to get stuff to the ports on the Caspian. You have to get it onto ships across the Caspian, offload again, either onto road or rail, ship it across 2, potentially 3 borders in the South Caucasus, then either back onto road or rail and the land route through northern Turkey, or back onto ships and then through the Black Sea, which has obviously 2 problems. One is that we still don't really have deep sea port capacity in Georgia. And the Black Sea itself is, let's say, a slightly risky route these days, given the war in Ukraine. On top of that, you have all the instability in the South Caucasus itself, with the still ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Plus, and again, this then comes back to your opening question about Iran. There's also significant tension between Iran and Azerbaijan, which is related, again, partly to the developments around Nagorno-Karabakh, but also the Azeri quite firm and hard push to create a rail connection between Azerbaijan and the Nakhchivan territory, which, again, I mean, that would directly rival connections through Iran, but obviously would also cut off Iran from a direct connection with Armenia. So I think in that sense, it's risky for China to invest too much. But on the other hand, it obviously creates huge opportunities. I mean, China is preparing or has been preparing for that for quite some years. And as we have seen at the Central Asia-China Summit in Xi'an 2 weeks ago, I mean, there is an enormous promise of investment into infrastructure there that would actually do quite a lot to, if you want, sort of make the eastern end or the eastern beginning of the middle corridor really fit for purpose. Finally, they might get around to building the Kyrgyz-Uzbek railway line. There have been promises of Chinese investment into port infrastructure in both Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan on the eastern part of the Caspian. So I think all of that in a way indicates that I think China does think there is potential promise in the middle corridor, but the infrastructure that it is building right now, certainly the land infrastructure, that also creates potential opportunities then to, I don't want to say divert, but certainly connect to existing land connections through the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And depending on how the situation in Afghanistan develops, there's always the prospect of the Trans-Afghan railway line to eventually come online. And that then would also eventually connect south to Pakistan and again open new routes onto maritime connections starting in the Arabian Sea.
Stefan, over and over again, the geopolitical image I have is that China creating these competing infrastructures coming westwards, you know, with maybe Berlin being the honeypot for all of that. And these countries are obviously very conscious of this grand geopolitical game playing out. Going west a bit, you know that Prime Minister Meloni in Italy now has to make a decision about commitments to China. You know, they have it on paper, but that needs to be translated into policy. One, do you think Italy under Meloni is prepared to step out of the fold a bit? And secondly, a broader question, because I know Ali is ready to pounce as well. The second question is something that I myself am grappling with, and that is, does Brussels fear China's ability to transform southern Mediterranean into its hub at the expense of European Union, or as you've intimated so many times, there is actually convergence of economic interest that would enable Brussels and Beijing to ultimately not work in parallel, but maybe to overweave with each other? What do you think?
I mean, my question to my answer to the second question, I think that would be a yes, but that is very much driven sort of by optimism rather than necessarily by a sort of very hard-hitting analysis. I mean, I can see both sides of the argument. I mean, on the one hand, I mean, China clearly is still a rising power. I mean, it clearly, I mean, if, I mean, those who follow sort of the Chinese foreign policy rhetoric, I mean, it clearly has intensified. It has become much more assertive under President Xi for the last 10 or so years. So I think China clearly wants to play a much more important global role, and certainly a much more decisive role in sort of what it considers probably the Eurasian space. And I really sort of think we need to sort of think of that as including Western Europe and the EU. So it's Eurasian, not in the sense that it ends somewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, but it's really from a Chinese perspective, it is the entire Eurasian landmass. But then, I mean, as you also indicated, that doesn't necessarily mean sort of a necessarily aggressive Chinese stance. I think sort of in my view, China would still probably prefer to get along with Europe to maintain and enhance sort of the economic interconnections with Europe, which partly also I think is sort of a dimension of the greater Chinese power play, where sort of better relations with Europe will also mean that China's own position vis-a-vis the US will improve, because there will be a degree of divergence between the US and Europe, where Europe clearly may potentially privilege its own economic interests and not follow always the very hard line that the US is driving right now. And I mean, when President Macron came back from his trip to China, and he said, well, Europe shouldn't get dragged into any Taiwan-related adventures. I think that was sort of an indication of where, from a Chinese perspective, things ideally could go. Now, having said that, I also think that Europe has to make a strategic choice where it wants to be, and I think ultimately that choice will be that Europe wants to be more with the US than necessarily with China. And I think there are all kinds of really good reasons for that. I mean, China is an important economic power, but I would argue its human rights record is probably not something that we want to replicate in Europe, or the Chinese governance model, or the Chinese model of economic development, or anything like that. So where does that leave Italy? Well, I think Italy is under significant pressure, especially from the US, to pull out of the BRI now. But also, as Prime Minister Meloni has indicated, I mean, pulling out of the BRI does not mean completely severing ties with China. And I mean, China has very strong economic ties with Germany, for example, and Germany never signed up to the BRI. So I think in that sense, there is as would be usual for Europe, there is enough ambiguity that you can read into whatever decision Italy will make, and however China will respond to that, it will not sort of lead to a permanent rupture of relations, which again, I also don't think would benefit anybody. It would not benefit China, it would not benefit Europe. So I think there will be a continuing, certainly economic cooperation, even though this may be subject to more rules, more regulations, and may at times be quite detached from the more combative political rhetoric on both sides.
Stefan, very few people have looked at the Eurasian Economic Union as closely as you have done. A couple of weeks ago, everybody was fearing about the debt ceiling. I have this metaphor that every 2 years wind comes, and then the corrugated sheets of American debt ceiling are flying in the air, and everybody looks into the house and says, oh my God, there's not much left. And then they patch it again. In that context, isn't the economic and fiscal power of China, given what you said in Xi'an and this 54 agreements, 9 multilateral agreements. It's real, it's tangible. And in that sense, isn't there a sense of, oh my God, we might as well hedge as well a bit towards east? And back to Afghan transit route. Isn't there a greater interest in stabilizing Afghanistan economy, whatever means they need to stop narcotics, to stop this, 20 years of disaster that was left behind? So wouldn't at some point EU and US want to see China succeed in Afghanistan to bring some closure?
Right. Okay. I'm starting at the back again with answers to your questions. I think everybody wants to see a stable Afghanistan that doesn't pose the kinds of threats that it basically has posed for most of my adult life, whether that's being a safe haven for various terrorist groups, whether it's the growth of opium, whether it's all kinds of smuggling activities, human trafficking, gun running, I mean, you name it. So I think that is for sure. The question is, to what extent will there be conditions on the part of the US that would sort of make it more or less difficult for that to happen. Now, just to give one example here, I mean, one of the key demands, both from the Taliban government in Kabul, but increasingly also from Russia and China, is that the US really should release the frozen assets of the previous Afghan governments, all the foreign assets that they have. Now, I think that is a legitimate question, what should happen with those. But I also think it completely overestimates how much these assets could actually help in the long term to stabilize Afghanistan. I mean, we are talking here probably a couple of $1 billion. I mean, I've seen different estimates. The highest I recall is something around $8 billion. Now, given the sheer scale of the problems that Afghanistan faces and has faced for many, many years, not just under the Taliban, but even prior to that, I mean, that's going to be a drop in the ocean. What Afghanistan really needs is something much more long-term. And it needs a real recovery plan. And I think here, sort of the American and Western reluctance to engage with the Taliban is actually not unjustified, because, I mean, what is going on in Afghanistan right now, I think, personally, is really detrimental to sort of the development of the country. It's hugely repressive, in particular of women and girls. And I think all the evidence that we have is that this does not make for good long-term prospects of development. So if you're just trying to, tweak along the margins and fix a bit here and fix a bit there, this is not going to provide a long-term solution to a problem that Afghanistan still poses, primarily for the region itself, but also beyond that. Now, having said that, I do actually think that there is an opportunity here potentially for more cooperation, certainly between China and the US, and possibly also the EU, China, and the US. So I think, I mean, if they set aside their differences in other areas, there might be ways here in which sort of a mutually beneficial arrangement can be found that would also help with the recovery of Afghanistan in the long term. And I mean, let's not forget, I mean, China now does have a position paper on Afghanistan as well. And yes, I mean, it blames the US for most of the ills of Afghanistan, but it also does insist, for example, on more inclusive government in Afghanistan, more respect for the rights of women and ethnic minorities. So I think this is in a way, again, I mean, it may or may not mean much, but it is potentially a basis upon which some engagement, again, could happen between Brussels, Beijing, and Washington, and gradually move sort of towards finding some relationship with a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. But now I definitely have forgotten the other two questions that you asked.
No, there was only one more question, which was about the debt ceiling, and I said it's like a corrugated roof that is blown off every 2 years. So
exactly. I think that's I mean, I'm not an expert in American politics. I mean, I leave that to my wife, who follows these things very closely. But what we both agree on is that, I mean, on the one hand, it makes no sense to have a debt ceiling in the way in which the Americans have it. In the past, they have always walked to the edge of the cliff and then taken a step back at the last moment. The problem is that a lot of the players that you have in the US now, especially sort of on the extreme end of the Republican movement, you just can't trust them as rational players. I mean, for them, drama is basically part of it. It's a feature of the system, not a bug. So, I mean, in the same way as here in the UK, I think a lot of people voted for Brexit just to see what would happen. I could totally see a scenario in the US at some point where people just will see, well, let's see what happens. And I mean, then you have a major problem that I think, I mean, nobody knows exactly what would happen, but I cannot see anything positive coming from the US going into default, even if it's a short-term default, which then, I mean, also in a way brings us back to one of the earlier questions that you asked about the potential rise of alternative currencies. And I think here, if I just may throw that in as a last thought, if you look at what the foreign ministers of the BRICS countries put out in their joint statement over the weekend after their summit in Cape Town, again, I mean, there's a clear push to not just align the BRICS with, say, the Chinese currency as an alternative international currency, if you want, but also trying increasingly to pull more countries from the global south into that alliance. So I think all of that in the end is sort of evidence that, I mean, if the current direction of travel prevails, there will be more fragmentation, both geopolitically, but also, and I think that's potentially the more dangerous even, is the geo-economic fragmentation, which, I mean, the World Bank and the IMF have had reports out to that effect several months ago, saying that this is a real danger for also the prospects of sustained long-term economic growth. So I think from that perspective, all of these things are interwoven in a very malign way, especially if you have players at the helm in these different parts of the world that really couldn't care less. I mean, for them, drama it's like a game. I mean, look at Boris Johnson here and what we have.
Stefan, we're mindful of your time. We'd love to have you back. One last question that we cannot let you get off of the program. We ask all of our guests is, what's your single piece of advice to cinephobes and cinephiles? And we'd love to have you back to talk about this massive landscape of Eurasia. But one piece of advice from Stefan Wolff to cinephobes and to cinephiles.
I think we just have to be realistic of what is possible. So, I mean, there will be no love breaking out between Washington and China, not under the next Chinese president, not under the next US president. But by the same token, I think we have to be very careful what we wish for. So in my area of study, we have this idea of the Thucydides trap, where inevitably, because the way things are going, you end up in a major military confrontation. And I think what xenophobes have to be aware of is that a lot of their rhetoric can become potentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. By the same token, I think xenophiles need to look at what's happening in China and think very carefully how much of that they would necessarily want to see replicated in what are still very liberal, both politically and economically, societies in the West.
So well put, Stefan. I'm very envious of your colleagues, your students, and all who interact with you on a regular basis.
Ask my students.
I am sure they will be as jealous and envious as the rest of us to not to be with you all the time. You've managed to put color in some of the holes of BRI Dialogue's analysis of China and Eurasia and great power relations and regional affairs as well, in such an immaculate and articulate way that, as Ali says, we've got to have you back again to probe deeper into West Asia, into the Balkans, into Southern Mediterranean, but of course the heartland being Europe itself. Of course, by then the war will have moved on, and be very important to have your perspectives on a post-conflict scenario at the heart of Europe and where that places Russia, European Union, United States, and China. All the things that we know you're grappling with. So we are now looking to have another date with you, Stefan, sooner than you think. So Ken Ali and I thank you warmly for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I mean your flattery certainly works. I can't wait for the next date that we'll have.
Thank you, Stefan.
Take care, guys. Thanks a lot, and do let me know when it's coming out. Yeah.
So greatly, really enjoyed meeting you.